everybody. Thanks to all our loyal listeners.
Radio.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you to all our loyal listeners out there. It's a cold night here in Washington, D.C. We're running with a little different format tonight. Julie hopes to call in around 7:30. We're not sure if we have Bob tonight because he's feeling under the weather. And Bibi is going to talk about the assassination of JFK and Nelson Mandela. I'm going to try my hand at producing tonight for the first time. So if you hear lots of silence, somebody please call me and let me know I've done something wrong. The number to dial if you want to call in and speak to Bibi is 347-996-3187. So why don't I hand over to him right now, and he will kick things off. Here you go.
Well, thanks, Maggie, for mentioning that I can kick something off. I used to play football, and when I played football, I actually kicked off to start every offensive series. So I'm not a complete beginner. I do hope you'll ask me a question now and then, just in case there's some detail you'd like me to expand on. But to begin with JFK, my family is Democratic, and Kennedy was a very, very visible Democrat. Very early in life, he was larger than life. Came from a dynastic family, had extraordinary looks and extraordinary charisma, was attractive to women and interesting to men, and had Hollywood good looks. So it was hard to grow up in the East and be a Democrat and not know a lot about his path through life. Also, I had gone to high school and college in Massachusetts and was that much closer to the Kennedy dynasty and its many facets because I'd been in the home state of the Kennedy clan. In fact, when I was a sophomore in college in 1963, that was when Kennedy got assassinated, and I remember that day very vividly. I was in a library, one of the 4 or 5 central libraries in the university, and I looked out and I saw people staggering around with stricken looks and expressions on their faces, so I went out into the campus and tried to find out what had happened, and most of the people that I ran into were women, and all the women were crying. So I really didn't know for about 10 or 15 minutes that Kennedy had been shot in Dallas, Texas. I was not even aware of the fact that he was in Dallas, Texas, because I had spent so much time studying that week that I hadn't followed his movements. At any rate, when the news finally hit me, one of the first thoughts I had was of a tragic hero in a Shakespeare play, someone whose path had so quickly. Oh, we've got a caller. We've got a caller, Maggie. No? Okay. Someone who ascended to great height so early in life that from a distance it might have looked as though he had too much hubris and therefore was stricken down. But at any rate, in the years between 1963 and 1976, I became a lawyer, licensed to practice law in the District of Columbia. And fortunately, having remained a Democrat, I had some contacts in the Democratic Party who knew some of the Democratic congressmen who served on the House of Representatives Select Committee on Assassinations. And so I was only 2 or 3 levels removed from the House Committee representatives who selected staff to serve on that committee, and I was there for 3 years, from 1976 to 1979. So it was a huge chapter in my life, and was really an extension of a familiarity with the Kennedy family and its history, in such a way that it was more like investigating a distant family member or a member of a closely affiliated family than it was of just investigating the assassination of a president. So I brought more background and familiarity and interest to my work as an attorney with the commission than a lot of people in their 20s and 30s who came to work on that staff. What is particularly interesting from the standpoint of the organization of the committee was that every lawyer was partnered with a homicide detective or some other kind of felony detective. In my case, I was partnered with a detective who had worked as an investigator for Bobby Kennedy's Senate Rackets Committee for a number of years, perhaps 10 years. So, okay, and so whenever the team of two people, the lawyer and the detective, traveled, we traveled together to investigate and to interrogate witnesses. And I was fortunate enough to have been sent to Dallas, of course, the site of the assassination, and then also to Fort Worth, Texas, then to Florida, then to Los Angeles. But the Fort Worth connection was the first connection to Dallas that I had the privilege of investigating, because there was a rumor that the board of directors of Texas Christian University in Fort Worth, Texas, had influenced the decision of where the president would send his motorcade. And it was thought that it was suspected that the influence of TCU was questionable, because TCU, being in Fort Worth, was under consideration as a possible site for the president to make his visit and make his speech. But the board of directors at TCU seemed to prefer that the central city in Texas for Kennedy's visit would be Dallas. So I was part of the team that went to speak to surviving members of the board of directors of Texas Christian University to find out what they remembered about why Fort Worth was not the destination of the Kennedy's trip, and why Dallas was. And that turned out to be a dead end. The investigation of the Fort Worth decision was not politically motivated and was not made by any one person who had suspicious associations. It was more the sense that Texas Christian University and Fort Worth were not major enough as cities and universities in Texas to deserve a presidential appearance. So that's why Fort Worth never figured into the scenario as a specific destination, and that's why I was sent to Fort Worth to investigate. The trips I made to Florida and to North Carolina and to California were to interview members of the Secret Service team who had been either superficially interviewed by the Warren Commission or not interviewed by them at all. So those were the 5 places: Dallas, Fort Worth, Miami and Tampa, Florida, Asheville, North Carolina, and Los Angeles, California, which I was assigned to visit. I had gone to junior high school in Los Angeles, so that was kind of a pleasant homecoming as well. In any case, my primary assignment was to serve on the team. We were called teams that investigated the motorcade, because if you're a Secret Service agent, to be very simple and direct, why would you want to expose the president in an open car in a wide open plaza surrounded by high buildings and have the route of the presidential limousine forced to come to almost a full stop twice in order to make a 90-degree right-hand turn upon entering Dealey Plaza, and then a 120-degree left-hand turn a few moments later. The average speed of the presidential limousine through Dealey Plaza was never more than 5 miles an hour, and was at some point was down around 2 or 3 miles an hour. So why would the Secret Service have allowed the presidential motorcade not only to be wide open and therefore an easy target for a shooter, but to be traveling so slowly? So a team of several of us were assigned to investigate everything we could find out about the motorcade in order to see whether it had been manipulated in a way that was favorable to a shooting, whether by one person or two, meaning a conspiracy. What we uncovered was the fact that the Secret Service had advised Kennedy to go to a different location in Dallas, a building which was the headquarters for the Women's Club of Dallas, and which had only one very narrow entryway and one very narrow exit, and was surrounded by buildings that were very easily secured. So it was Kennedy himself who decided to reject the safer and more secure of the two destinations and to drive through Dealey Plaza in an open limousine with no protection at all. And so the question becomes, what was the motivation of Kennedy in choosing a less secure route and in choosing to drive in an open limousine? And the answers we uncovered to those questions were, very simply, Kennedy himself wanted to prove to Texas that he was just as tough and resilient and brave as any Texan cowboy or Texan politician, and therefore he would not appear to be intimidated by the risk of an open limousine traveling at slow speed, but rather embraced it because it gave him the opportunity to display his courage very openly and for a very long time, sitting right next to his wife and right next to the governor of Texas and his wife. So there's a fine line between courage and recklessness or foolhardiness. Kennedy trod that line, and which side he stepped onto is a subject of debate that's been going on for 50 years. Because I was doing an investigation as a lawyer, personally come down on the side of whether Kennedy was a bit reckless in ignoring the security that the Secret Service tried to provide him. But I know the position can be argued either way. Dallas at that time had a reputation for being a very, very tough town. And Kennedy was a northern liberal going into a southern conservative state. So by the criterion of common sense, the smart decision would have been to drive in a closed limousine to a more secure place. That's where the historians can take up the analysis. I suppose the ultimate question about the assassination is whether there was a conspiracy or not. The Warren Commission decided to reject that theory and supported the single bullet theory, namely that one of the bullets Oswald shot from a .30-30 rifle about 80 or 100 yards away entered Kennedy's body, exited Kennedy's body, entered the governor's body, then exited the governor's body. One bullet, the Warren Commission determined, did all that damage. So immediately we come to the question of ballistics. I don't think the American people knew as much about ballistics in 1963 as they know today. I don't think the average policeman knew as much about ballistics as a criterion for membership in a police force as he or she would know 50 years later. But speaking as a layman who's studied this issue off and on over a period of 50 years, by common sense, it seems very unlikely to many people that one bullet could have entered and exited two bodies and then retained 95% of its original shape. Usually bullets deform when they hit a body unless they pass through soft tissue, and some bullets deform even when they pass through nothing but soft tissue and do not hit bone. The bullet that was presented by the Warren Commission in the photograph, published and released by the Commission, shows just a tiny little tip of that bullet, just a tiny nick, was missing when the bullet was recovered. So I think by contemporary standards, that bullet does not support a single bullet theory, because if a bullet had entered and exited two bodies, it would show more damage, more wear and tear. At any rate, even though the Warren Commission concluded that there was no conspiracy, the Assassinations Committee, the Select Committee on Assassinations that held session from 1976 through 1979, concluded that there was a conspiracy. And that conspiracy was based on a tape, an audio tape that was made in Dealey Plaza by a microphone that was on the handlebars of a police officer, the handlebars of a police motorcycle that was parked and stock still in Dealey Plaza. That microphone picked up every sound that was made in Dealey Plaza, and that microphone was connected to a tape recorder in the Dallas Police Department headquarters. The state of electrical engineering in 1963 was much simpler than the state of electrical engineering in 1978 and 79. So the engineers who analyzed that tape were able to lift more information off that tape than the Warren Commission was able to do. And the engineers who studied that same tape in 1978 stated that it was at least 90 to 95% probable that the sounds made by two separate guns were audible on that tape. Of course, sounds made on a tape, not made by a human voice, don't lead to the identification of a person. But the scientific evidence in 1978 that we released in 1979 was clearly electronically in favor of there being two shooters. By coincidence, in the, I believe, November of 2013, I happened to be shopping for groceries in a giant store where the tabloid entitled Confidential was being sold. I purchased one because in the headline on the cover of that issue was the statement, "Kennedy conspiracy has been proved." And the article in that particular issue stated that before dying, the person who deemed himself the other shooter of a .45 caliber handgun confessed to being in Dealey Plaza on the grassy knoll on the right-hand side of the presidential limousine and a little forward of it, and stated that he wanted to confess to make himself a part of history and to ease his conscience. But he is now dead and cannot be interrogated. So whether we can take very seriously his confession as supporting the electronic information from the tape is one of the many closed questions surrounding this assassination. So we would move necessarily to the question of motivation. What had Kennedy done that would make anyone want to kill him? One prominent theory
is that Kennedy had authorized his younger brother, Robert, whom he appointed to be Attorney General, to defang the mafia. And it is a matter of historical record that the chief mafia don in New Orleans, one Carlos Marcello, was exported and sent back from New Orleans via Mexico to Italy, never to return. I'm pretty sure that did not make John or Bobby very popular in the mafia. Do I have a caller? Do I have a caller? I'm listening.
Oh, I'm here, baby. It's Julie.
Oh, it's Julie. Let me... Are you going to talk, Julie, or should I keep going? You have a question?
I'm fascinated. Keep talking.
Well, I'm shocked because I've been so close to this material for so long that it's no longer as appealing and engaging as it was at the time. But at any rate, remaining on the theme of who might have disliked JFK enough to want to kill him, there's the Bay of Pigs scenario. And this is a place, the Bay of Pigs is a place on the south coast of Cuba where a number of anti-Castro Cubans who had been living in Florida and training under the CIA launched an invasion in order to, by stealth, assassinate Castro for having exiled them from their native land. I think there were roughly a few dozen men, all born in Cuba, all exiled from Cuba by Castro, who participated in the water-to-land invasion at the Bay of Pigs. What may have motivated anti-Castro Cubans to want to kill JFK was that Kennedy did two things. He promised this group of anti-Castro Cubans, when they completed their training, JFK hoped that one day the flag of a free Cuba would be raised in Havana. And he also promised that when these men landed on the beach in the Bay of Pigs, he would provide them with air cover. For reasons which are not clear historically, the decision was made not to provide air cover. In retrospect, it may have been taken as an act of war by Cuba and by Cuba's allies, the chief ally of Cuba, of course, being Russia. So a military conflict might have spread from the Bay of Pigs to Florida if Kennedy had provided air cover. That's a speculation on my part. I have no factual basis for suggesting that air cover was removed because it might have provoked military conflict.
I would like to ask you a question.
Certainly.
Do you know what it is? Patricia Duff. Talk about Patricia Duff, because she went on to become a notorious, much-married millionaire.
Well, I knew Patricia when she was on the staff of the investigative staff of the Select Committee, but I knew her as someone who had just graduated from college, and I think it was probably her first job, and certainly her first job in Washington that, because of its congressional context, would have been perceived as a significant position. But at any rate, Patricia was very attractive, very smart, very well-dressed, very ambitious, and very confident. I remember in particular a time when she and I were asked to meet a Frenchman or at least a person who gave his name as French, in a hotel in Washington. He didn't want to come to the Congress, perhaps because he didn't want to be seen in the presence of a congressional investigator. But in any case, the appointment was made for Patricia and me to interview him and find out as much as we could about him and the information he wanted to provide the committee. But in this particular case, this French gentleman seemed to think that Patricia and I, neither of us, had sufficient seniority and rank to justify his disclosure of information. I think he wanted to talk to someone whom he would have perceived as senior in rank and with a lot of power to do something with the information he wanted to provide. So he just fell silent, said, "Sorry, I'm not talking to you." And Patricia and I had to go back to the staff or back to the Congress and report that the witness had refused to communicate. On the issue of a French involvement, there was a book published in France stating that a French intelligence agent had contributed to manipulating Oswald, and that this agent had been successful in manipulating Oswald and knew that the assassination was going to take place. And since I was the only person on the staff of the committee who could read French, I read and translated that book and circulated the translation. And the name of the French agent who allegedly manipulated Oswald was very clearly presented in that book. So a lot of us spent a lot of time trying to find a living Frenchman by that name who had been in Dallas at that time. But we were unsuccessful in tracing any French person by that name or through, with our limited resources, we were just unable to find out whether a person with that name had been in the United States, much less in Texas, in November of 1963. But it was a very interesting experience for me to use my background in the French language as part of my investigative activity. At any rate, we have now on the list of suspects for people interested in killing Kennedy, the Mafia, the exiled anti-Castro Cubans, and then, of course, Castro himself, who, finding out about the Bay of Pigs incident, believed that the CIA was behind the invasion at the Bay of Pigs, and therefore wanted to investigate the CIA to find out if there was anybody in the CIA who was part of the team that wanted to assassinate Castro, but susceptible to manipulation in the sense that if Castro found out who it was in the CIA that wanted to kill him, he could manipulate that person into helping organize an assassination attempt against Kennedy. So Castro was a suspect, and in fact, our deputy chief counsel went to Havana to interview Castro at length, and Castro very vigorously denied any motivation to kill Kennedy or JFK or Bobby. And the team that went to Cuba to interview Castro was impressed with Castro's sincerity and chose not to pursue that aspect of the investigation at all. Also on the list of suspects are mafiosos who were very prominent in Cuba as the capos in charge of the enormous gambling and rackets operations run by the mafia in Cuba. And Bobby did a lot to curtail that activity. And as some of you may know, there is a tradition in the mafia is that when you want to hurt someone, you don't kill that person. You kill someone close to them and leave them in a state of continuing grief. So according to this theory, the motivation of Cuban... Got some static. The motivation of the Cuban mafia... Julie, were you speaking?
I'm just asking if the static is me because I'm on my hands-free in the car.
Okay. Well, then I'll keep going unless you have a question.
Nope, go ahead.
Okay. The story goes like this, that when the mafia wants to really hurt somebody, they don't kill that person, they kill someone close to them. So the motive for having Kennedy assassinated was to strike back at Bobby.
Interrupt for just 1 second there. Julie, do you have any updates on Chris Christie's Port Authority problem? I've been hearing all about it here this week.
I'm sorry, Maggie. Say that one more time.
Do you have any updates on Chris Christie's Port Authority problem?
I have nothing new since, what was published in the last couple of days.
All right. So we'll just keep the heat on him, I guess.
I wish that I had updates, but there is, we're kind of, I think, in a holding pattern. I don't think that the Assembly has had any additional hearings since since what was published yesterday.
Yeah, we'll just have to keep encouraging them to continue.
Yeah. I think that, one of the things that has come up is, I believe the gentleman's name is Matthew Mowers, who has gone off to New Hampshire. That he was the guy who was encouraging a lot of these Democratic mayors. I say encouraging in quotes. Encouraging a lot of the Democratic mayors to endorse the governor for re-election.
Wow.
Promises were made. Yeah, promises were made. Arms were twisted, and when these mayors went back after the election to follow up on the promises that were made to them and the assurances that were made if they endorsed the governor, the guy was gone and nobody knew anything about it.
Wow. Well, I guess he's going to stay there. I'd better let BB get back to his assassination story. I just wanted to check.
Yeah.
I'll be looking forward to hearing an update on the Port Authority issue when you get some new information, Julie. Don't forget to share that with us.
I will.
Okay, great. Perhaps at the top of the list of suspects, apart from pro-Castro Cubans, anti-Castro Cubans, Cuban mafia, and the American mafia in general, was Lee Harvey Oswald himself. And there is no question that Lee Harvey Oswald's behavior after the assassination is consistent with some complicity, or at least some knowledge of the assassination and circumstances surrounding it, because if you have done nothing, and this is a principle that is widely accepted in American law enforcement, if a person has committed no crime, he does not behave the way Oswald did. Oswald made great haste to get away from the school book depository building as quickly as possible. And then let me throw out a little-known fact. There is evidence to the effect that he went home because he expected to be picked up and taken somewhere in hiding. there was a statement released by his housekeeper who stated that a car containing several men drove up shortly after the assassination and waited about 5 or 10 minutes and then drove away not very long before Oswald arrived at the house expecting to be picked up. That statement was never confirmed because the car was never identified either as to its passengers or its license plate. In any case, if you're completely innocent, why would you shoot a police officer? I think the police officer named Tippit, T-I-P-P-I-T-T, whom Oswald shot after leaving the school book depository building and possibly after leaving his home where he expected to be picked up, stopped Oswald probably because Oswald was behaving suspiciously, walking nervously and furtively alone in a remote corner. Also, there was a police report to the effect that the assassin was a lone gunman because his rifle had been found abandoned several stories up in the school book depository building. So Tippit may have put two and two together and said, this guy who's behaving so strangely, so nervously, so defensively may have been the same guy who shot the rifle that was discovered in the school book depository building. So Tippit went over to just simply stop Oswald and question him, whereupon Oswald, I believe, used Tippit's .38 caliber revolver and shot Tippit dead, and then continued on to the movie house where he was behaving suspiciously in body language, so much so that the teller in the booth of the movie house who was selling tickets reported him to the police. Some very strange man, acting very strangely, just bought a ticket and went into the movie house. So that's how the police knew where Oswald was and knew where to go to get him to arrest him. I've just been talking about Oswald's behavior after the assassination. What about Oswald's behavior before the assassination? He wanted to go live in Russia under communist rule. And when the Russians rejected him, he tried to commit suicide. Or at least that's what the Russians reported. And the Russians took Oswald's suicide attempt as an expression of seriousness of purpose about wanting to live in the Soviet Union. So Oswald got to live in the Soviet Union under a communist regime and married a Russian woman with whom he returned to the United States and came to live, of all places, in Dallas, Texas. Could Oswald have been so much of a communist that he would want to kill the President of the United States? It's a valid question. Was Oswald steered to Dallas, Texas by people who were manipulating him into a position where he could work in a building that gave him a clear shot into the presidential limousine? There is no question that Oswald lived in company with a number of prominent members of the Russian community of Dallas, Texas, one of whom was a high-ranking Russian aristocrat whose presence in Dallas has never been properly explained. His name was Demorenschildt, Demorenschildt, and had a lot of wealth and a lot of status back in Russia. What was he doing in Dallas? Hobnobbing with Oswald. Was he part of a conspiracy to manipulate Oswald into doing more than just living in Texas with his Russian wife? At any rate, there's another aspect of Oswald's life which is not in the forefront of many minds. It is alleged that Oswald attempted to shoot an American Army general in Texas in the months before the Kennedy assassination. I believe that general's name was Walker. I don't remember whether he was considered far right or far left, but at very least the suspicion was that Oswald was practicing shooting someone in order to work his way up to taking on the shooting of a president. And then, of course, the big question, perhaps the biggest question about Oswald's behavior before the shooting is just how exactly did he get that job in the Texas School Book Depository building, where from the window from which his rifle was apparently shot, it was a direct line of fire, open and unobstructed, into the presidential limousine. So when you start adding up all these bits and pieces of Oswald's background, not to forget the fact that he was rated an expert sharpshooter when he was in military service in Japan, it does seem to emerge that there was more than just a series of coincidences. One could reasonably argue that various forces were brought to bear on Oswald's life in such a way that if, as is arguably the case, he had the motivation to kill the president, he certainly was provided with social support in the Russian community and certainly was hired to work in the School Book Depository building in a location which gave him an excellent line of fire. There's also a story about Oswald being a suspicious person in the opinion of the Dallas FBI, and there's an episode where an FBI agent in Dallas had an altercation with Oswald and wrote him up as a suspicious person. But the FBI never focused enough resources on investigating Oswald closely enough to find out whether or not he was a potential assassin. I guess at this point, listeners may wonder whether they should blame the New Orleans Mafia, the Cuban Mafia, Castro, or the anti-Castro Cuban exiles as the group or the individual most likely to want to, or Oswald, as the group or individual most likely to want to see Kennedy killed. Problem. Before Oswald could be interrogated at length and in depth, Jack Ruby shot him dead. So one of the major questions about the period after Oswald's arrest and incarceration is, how did Jack Ruby know that Oswald was going to be coming out of the Dallas Police Department headquarters at that particular time? And how come the security surrounding Oswald was not stronger? So the plot gets thicker and murkier. Ruby was a low-ranking Chicago mob figure who'd come to Dallas and worked primarily managing strippers. He was not actively involved in murders or felonies. He was just a low-life, low-rank mob hanger-on, someone of sufficient insignificance to be told, all you got to do is just shoot this guy and we'll take care of you and get some money. That didn't happen. Ruby did a lot of cold time in jail before dying of cancer. So without Oswald to interview and without Ruby to interview, the Warren Commission was at a disadvantage, and we were at an even worse disadvantage in the Assassinations Committee. Beginning 11 years after the Warren Commission completed its work.
What about that investigator who was killed?
There were several investigators who were killed. That's
you had felt you might be.
Well, I was taken to every interrogation by my partner, who was senior to me, a detective with decades of felony investigation experience. But at some point it was arranged by someone, I don't know who, for him to investigate or to interview a high-ranking CIA official, very high-ranking in the area of covert operations. And my partner turned to me and said, Belford, I'm going to be investigating this particular person, and I don't think you ought to come. I think this is a sensitive interview that might be a little prickly, and I wouldn't want you to pay a price for any questions that I might ask that might irritate this guy, because this is a very, very powerful, very, very senior CIA official. Within days after that interview took place, my partner was found shot dead. I did not attend the interview, shortly after which he was shot dead. I know nothing of what was asked or said in that interview. But it does seem likely that if I'd heard everything that my partner heard, including my partner asking a question that might have been a little too sensitive, I might have been shot dead too. At any rate, there was a lot of feeling on the part of many people in the Secret Service and the FBI and the CIA that those three agencies had not cooperated with one another fully before or after the assassination. There was a lot of suspicion that each one of those agencies knew something it didn't want to share with the other two agencies. There was a lot of suspicion that each agency had something it wanted to cover up and not tell anybody, not the other two agencies and not the government and not the Congress. So it may have been not so much that my partner asked the wrong question as that he asked, it may have been that my partner didn't ask a question that he knew was too sensitive. He may have accidentally asked a question that was very sensitive without knowing how sensitive it was to the CIA official he was interviewing. And the CIA official may have inferred that my partner knew more than he knew. The CIA official may have thought that because he thought fact A was secret, and then when a question asked by my partner seemed to touch upon fact A, the CIA official may have inferred that my partner knew about fact A. And if the CIA didn't want fact A to be known, that could have been a motive for killing my partner and for killing me if I heard the question. I might have been assumed to have known the deeper significance of the question if I'd been in the presence of that official when that question was asked. But again, I don't know anything that was said in that particular interview because I wasn't present. The next major issue is the medical evidence, which of Kennedy's body. There was a lot of evidence, which combined with the ballistics evidence, told many stories. But because the Warren Commission came up with the single bullet theory, a lot of open questions that dangled in the air around the investigative staff and around the legions of historians and journalists who probed the assassination and published about it never got the attention they might well have deserved. The obvious major problem with the medical evidence is that Kennedy's brain disappeared shortly after Kennedy's body was returned from Dallas to the Bethesda Naval Hospital. And the receiving surgeon, who had jurisdiction by custom over the body, died very shortly, so he could never, after the brain disappeared, so he could never be questioned about why the brain disappeared. He could never been questioned about the condition of the brain. And, of course, the central significance of the brain is that it would have shown whether there were 2 bullet paths or 1. If there are 2 bullet paths, it's pretty obviously a conspiracy. So when the brain disappears, the best evidence of a conspiracy or a single bullet theory vanishes. As you may recall, the single bullet theory was that the bullet entered in the rear of Kennedy's skull and exited through his throat in the vicinity of his windpipe before entering Governor Connolly's wrist and then exiting the governor's wrist and landing in the governor's thigh. If there had been just one bullet path through the brain, the single bullet theory is supported by the medical evidence. Without the brain, the single bullet theory is not as well supported as it is by other medical evidence. An interesting point about the exit wound in the front of Kennedy's throat is that at Parkland Hospital, where Kennedy's body was taken immediately after the shooting, Kennedy was breathing when he was brought to the hospital. So right in the vicinity of the exit wound in the front of his throat, an incision was made to open access to his windpipe so that oxygen could be placed directly in his lungs to keep him breathing. But unfortunately, too much damage had been done to the brain and the thorax for Kennedy to continue to live. Another aspect of the medical evidence is that there's a book called Rush to Judgment, which contains excerpts from the interrogation of the physicians who received the body of JFK at Parkland Hospital. They were formally interrogated by attorneys from the Warren Commission staff. Many of those physicians testified initially on direct examination when just starting to testify and answering simple, direct questions, stated that they believed that the wound on the right-hand side of Kennedy's skull, or that there was a wound on the right-hand side of Kennedy's skull above the hairline, and that it was an entry wound. But as the questioning continues, a number of the doctors who said that that was their initial first impression changed their minds and said that the entry wound on the right-hand side of the Kennedy's skull near the front hairline, above the ear and to the front of the ear, was really an entry wound that came in through the back of the skull. And why did those doctors, historians have asked, change their testimony from an entry wound on the right-hand side of the middle of Kennedy's skull to an entry wound at the rear of Kennedy's skull? That's a question that those doctors are not around to go back into. But 4 or 5 of them changed their testimony. It wasn't just 1 or 2, it was at least 3, maybe 4 or 5. And so direct medical testimony that there would be an entry wound coming into Kennedy's skull from the right-hand side, from the direction of the grassy knoll, never became the final resting place of the testimony of the doctors who first examined Kennedy's body. If those doctors had stuck to their original story, that would have supported a conspiracy because there would have been an entry wound at the rear of Kennedy's skull and an entry wound at the side of Kennedy's skull. And you can't have 2 separate entry wounds without having a conspiracy. At any rate, there is not much else than the ballistics evidence and Oswald's sudden escape from the schoolbook depository to support the single bullet theory. The ballistics evidence of a single bullet theory is questionable. The medical evidence in terms of what was observed in Kennedy's body does not unqualifiedly support the single bullet theory. So what remains of the single bullet theory is, what do we know about Oswald's activities in the schoolbook depository that morning? And if I recall correctly, a number of witnesses testified that they saw Oswald enter the schoolbook depository on the morning of the assassination carrying a long, slim object that closely resembled the shape of a rifle. I cannot remember at this point whether any of those witnesses specifically testified that he or she saw a rifle or saw the shape of a rifle in the package Oswald was carrying. But certainly there is a consistency in the testimony of people who saw Oswald enter the building, is that he had some long, slender object with him when he entered it. There is also a photograph taken from the street level in Dealey Plaza showing a rifle barrel pointing out and downward from the schoolbook depository toward the limousine. And that photograph was taken shortly before Kennedy was shot. So of all the evidence gathered by the Warren Commission, that photograph, combined with the testimony of the people who saw Oswald enter the schoolbook depository building that morning, is the strongest evidence in support of the single bullet theory that we have to date. And there was no finding whatsoever by the Select Committee on Assassinations that photograph was not valid. Continuing with the theme momentarily of photography, Oswald, as people in my generation know from a photograph published in Life magazine, and I believe on the cover of Life magazine, was photographed carrying a rifle which is identical to the rifle that Oswald presumably abandoned when he escaped from the schoolbook depository. So we have the rifle that was found in the depository tied to Oswald by his being photographed with it, and tied to Oswald by the photograph that shows that rifle being pointed at the limousine shortly before the assassination. And then, of course, the rifle itself is evidence that the shot was fired from that rifle, from that location, and who was in that location if not Oswald. Did you have a question, Maggie? Oh, okay. Well, let me try to wrap this up. Putting aside the article in the tabloid Confidential, which contained the confession of a second shooter shooting from the grassy knoll, we come to a fork in the road. The electrical engineers that worked for the Warren Commission did not hear two shooters. The electrical engineers who worked for the Select Committee on Assassination did hear two shooters on the tape, and then several years after our Select Committee was disbanded, other electrical engineers showed up and said there were not two shooters on that tape. That's going to wrap up this overview of the Kennedy assassination. I hope some of you have heard some fresh information. I encourage you to pursue it, and thank you very much for your time and attention. Julie, how are you doing?
I am well, thank you.
Good. You sound great.
Thanks. Running between events tonight, so that's why you got me on the cell phone.
Oh, I see. Well, are you at rest in one place now?
I am.
Or are you still traveling? Oh, you're good.
Nope,
okay, well,
yeah.
I think I may get a glass of ice water to help out with this dry throat. So I'm going to turn the reins over to you for a while and listen with great interest to what you have to say.
Okay, Julie, let it rip.
Oh, wow. Well, I don't have much time to let it rip because I've arrived at my son's concert and I'm just about to run inside there.
Ooh, what time is it starting?
It started at 7:30, but he didn't go on first, so I had a few minutes to sit.
Goodness, Julie. You'd better get in there quickly. They may not allow you in, you know.
Well, I have a couple more minutes because he doesn't go on for a few more minutes.
Okay, go on then.
So we're, things are kind of quiet up here in New Jersey.
Yeah.
Other than the fact that we have our little thing going on with the Port Authority and the investigations and I won't even call it investigations, it's just hearings in the legislature.
Mm-hmm.
But the good news is that the press outside of New Jersey is actually paying attention to this. So
well, they are now because Christie has made it clear he's running for president.
Yes. So, it's going to, I think it will get interesting.
How do you think Kim and her family will feel about him running for president?
I think that, I think that she would probably welcome him being out of state.
Oh. Yeah. Okay. All right.
I think it would be interesting. It'll be interesting to see what happens, when he's out of state, when he's not around. And, obviously, as long as he's still the governor, she won't be able to act on her own.
That's true. Yeah.
But, at the point in which he steps down, if he does step down, if it even gets that far.
Yeah.
That'll be something that's interesting to watch. But she's got her own troubles.
Does she?
Well, yeah, she was involved in the whole thing down in Hunterdon County where Christie had the Attorney General come in and shut down the prosecutor's office.
Oh, that's right. I forgot about that.
Yeah. Part of that was involving the sheriff down there possibly allowing her staff to staff Kim during the campaign while on duty.
Oh, my goodness.
So those were allegations that were made. And, it'll be interesting to see that start to unfold in January and see where it goes, if it goes anywhere at all.
True. We should probably take a little break and, make sure we're all fired up for January 1st.
Yeah. Yeah.
And we have next week.
Yes, we have Sal next week, which I think will be a great show.
It will. It will be really, really good because he's done so much good for people. He
really has. He's such an amazing advocate.
He is. Yeah.
And no matter what's going on with him, and he's had his issues going on, health-wise, and he makes no secret about that, but it doesn't ever stop him from what he's doing.
That is
plugging away.
Mhm. Yeah, he's had a tough year, I think, as well, health-wise, but it hasn't slowed him down too much.
No, not at all.
Mm.
So
we can look forward to that, and I know you're going to have a wonderful time at the concert.
I am. It's acoustic night, so I get a break from the electric guitar, but but of course I always enjoy listening to my son play because he's so talented.
Of course, absolutely. There never was a son more talented as yours, Julie. I just know this. I only met him for a brief moment, but I could tell.
He puts all of his focus on that. I wish that he had a little bit left over for his schoolwork, but someday when he's burning up the charts, I'll be less concerned about the fact that he didn't do his schoolwork, I suppose.
Exactly. When Bruce Springsteen is calling you, asking you if you could get tickets for him, then you won't be sorry.
Yeah.
Well, I'll let you go so you can relax a little bit and enjoy.
Okay, thank you.
And we'll see you back here.
Okay. We'll see you back here next week.
Absolutely. Thanks so much, Julie.
Okay,
bye.
Have a good night.
You too. Bye.
Bye.
Okay, so that just about wraps everything up for tonight. And I'm sorry we had a few little technical problems because I have never produced a radio show before, but, there's always a first time. And now that it's all over, I guess I can take a little break and relax. So we will see you back here next Wednesday night at 7 p.m. Don't forget the dial-in number is 347-996-3187. And we will have a very special guest from the disabled community, an advocate, I should say, for the disabled community from New Jersey, from Bergen County. So we will talk to Sal next week, and we'll see you all then. Bye.